Hello everyone, welcome to week number 2 of our stained glass flower puzzle quilt. This is a mystery quilt along, and I'm so glad you've joined me today. You can see my tabletop is much more clear as we begin this week's video, and I do imagine that this week's video is going to be way shorter than last week. Last week we had a lot of information to cover, materials I was going to use for my quilt and color suggestions that you could use. We went over some of the supplies, and then we went over the basic method for tracing our pieces, doing the applique for our pieces, and then joining our pieces to the puzzle base. I'm going to show you right here a progress picture of where I'm at after week 1, and this is my quilt so far. And this is how far we've come, and this week we are joining pieces for week number 2, so I'm really excited. As you can see, I've already went through all of my fabrics and I cut my 5-inch squares, and these are my 6 squares that I'm going to use for this week. So let's go ahead and reveal week number 2 puzzle pieces. Here we are. Week number 2. Now, if you would like to get this week's puzzle pieces, they will be in a link in the description box of this video. And if you are just joining in and you missed week 1, I'm going to put a link to that video in the description box as well. And to make it really easy to find all of these videos in one place, I did create a playlist for this puzzle quilt. So you can just go to the playlist and save that. And then all of these videos will be in one place. Also, I wanted to mention, as we get started this week, if you are watching this quilt and this series, and it's something that you're interested in, but you haven't quite decided if you're going to make this quilt, and you're waiting till the very last week to join in and get your puzzle pieces, I think that's great. And I'm just really glad that you're joining in, even if you decide not to make this quilt. But in the 8th week, along with that week's puzzle pieces, I'm going to release a separate Etsy listing that will have a 27-page PDF, and it will be all of your weeks in one download. To make it simple, instead of going to each video after you've watched all of them and getting your pieces at the end, if you decide to make this quilt, it is all combined into a 27-page PDF. So we're going to go ahead and get started with week number 2 and our pieces. This PDF is 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. And we are working on the second row of our quilt. So all of our pieces will be A2, B2, C2, and so on. So we are filling in this row right here. You can see there's no solid blocks, and so we're doing applique in 6 different blocks this week. And just like I explained in last week's video, the polka dotted areas are white fabric for your applique, and the wavy lines are green. And so this week you can see we're going to be using plenty of white, and then we get into some green as we move along to the right side of our quilt. So I plan on making this a very short and sweet video, and again, if you're just joining in to this series, go back and watch video 1 and skip through the sections to the parts that you might have questions about. Because yeah, I really break it down into materials and then the method and techniques that we're going to use in this quilt. So I'm not going to be explaining a lot of what I'm doing. I'm just going to bring you along. I think it'll be really fun just to break up our week on Wednesday and spend some time with one another and get those creative juices flowing. So I will speed up the process. I will bring you along as I trace out my pieces, cut them out, and join them to my quilt blocks. I'll bring you along for part of the stitch out. I really showed in detail that part. And I kept my little stitch sample, and I wrote down my settings on my machine so I can duplicate the same stitch. And I think I might have a little tip towards the end if your pieces are not lining up exactly with your satin stitch. So stay tuned for that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And we are ready to start tracing all of our pieces. I have my piece of freezer paper here, and I'm going to go around each one of the pieces and trace them out directly on the line, just like so. And we are tracing on the dole side, not the plastic coating side. And this week I've decided to go ahead and trace all of my pieces all at the same time, and I think that will save myself a little bit of time in the long run. I'm going to mark all of my pieces according to which block that they go to. I think once I cut all my pieces, it'll help me stay more organized. I won't have to guess and accidentally put the pieces in the wrong blocks. I'm also going to draw some arrows just to help me realize which side goes up. I think that will help. And we're just going to go along and trace each one. So I'd be really excited to see your progress from last week's video. If you want to share pictures over on my Facebook page, that would be great. And if you have any questions, maybe take a picture and show me a picture of what you have a question about. That might be easy to help answer any questions. Going through, still tracing out each one of our pieces. There's a big plane going by overhead. This is our last piece. And now that we have all of them traced, I can go ahead and separate each one of the pieces with a pair of scissors, and we're roughly cutting out our pieces. We're not cutting them out directly on the line. Just giving ourselves a little space around each one. So I'll go through and separate each one of my pieces. If you are making this quilt, I hope that you are having a lot of fun so far. And once we have all of our pieces cut out, we can bring in our fabric and heat up the iron. Now I have my templates back as a reference. I went through and picked out a fabric for each one of my template pieces, and we are ready to go ahead and fuse them onto the fabric. So remember, with the freezer paper, we are fusing our pieces to the pretty side of the fabric. And I have my iron set on a cotton setting with no steam. Once I fuse my pieces onto the fabric, I'll separate all the good stuff left over and put my pieces off to the side. Projects like these are great for using up scraps. So I save just about everything in my studio. So we'll go through and fuse all of these fabrics down. I would be so happy to see the fabrics that you have chosen for your quilt. I think even though we are all using the same pattern, we're going to get some amazingly different results based on our different fabric choices. Now once you've fused all of your pieces down, you can go ahead and cut them out directly on the line this time. And keep in mind, the accuracy of your piece is going to be based on how accurate you were with tracing and how accurate you are with cutting. You're going to see as we finish this video up and I fuse my final pieces that some of my tracing probably wasn't as accurate as I wished it would have been, or I cut my pieces off a little bit too short. And so you'll notice I'm going to start having some issues, but I think because it's an art quilt, we can get away with a little bit more. Here's our pieces, and I will finish cutting them all out. At this point, I have all of my pieces cut out, just like this. And I've laid them out on each of the assigned blocks. So it might help to keep your little grid handy. And now we are going to start gluing our pieces on the individual blocks. For this part of the process, I'm going to be using a glue stick, and we are gluing around the entire raw edge of our piece and then lining it up according to our little puzzle piece, just like that. Then we can dry the glue with an iron and peel off the freezer paper, just like that. So I'm going to go through each one of these pieces and just bring you along as I'm working. We're going to glue this piece down, and you're going to see that this particular brown block is going to be an issue in this row. Evidently, I did not cut this my brown block exactly out at 5 inches. So you'll see the little bit of extra fabric at the bottom. I just went through and trimmed that off. But you'll also notice I left a little bit up at the top, and I should have trimmed that too, because when I go to line up all my pieces on my fabric base at the end, I'm going to have a little bit of an issue. There's my pieces, and we're going to continue on. So usually I use a wet glue when I use freezer paper to do applique, because I do not like getting glue all over my fingers when I'm working. But I know most people that I've talked to, they prefer the glue stick. And so I'm going to stick with it and use the glue stick in this whole quilt. Now we're coming to our puzzle piece C2. You'll notice a little bit that is anchored in the center along the top edge. I made myself some reference points, and that's going to help me put in that little triangle piece up at the top. Now my little piece of fabric comes loose from the freezer paper, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of a glue stick, because I think it really pulls at your fabric and sometimes it can separate the freezer paper. But the freezer paper really gives your fabric some body and makes it a lot easier to work with. But you can see I still managed to line up that piece of fabric right in those reference points, and I'm able to place it without any issues. We'll go ahead and dry the glue and then remove the other 2 pieces of freezer paper. So I'd be very curious as to what your thoughts are about the freezer paper applique. If you've tried it before, I would love to see projects and quilts that you've done using this technique. If you want to share them over on Facebook, I would love to see them. I do think you could do this process using Heat and Bond Light instead of freezer paper. If you decide to go that route, you will have to mirror image your puzzle pieces because you'll be fusing your heat and bond to the back side of your fabric. But the freezer paper is a good, inexpensive way to do raw edge applique, and I've always been a fan of using the freezer paper. Still gluing all of our edges. I do think I'm going to go through quite a few glue sticks in this quilt project, and I'm going to have to go back to the store and get a couple more glue sticks. The freezer paper lifts off pretty easy, especially when it's still a little bit warm. And now we are fusing our last two pieces on our puzzle block F2. Don't you think that little pebble fabric is so pretty? I used that as sashing in a t-shirt quilt and it turned out fabulous. Now I can remove the freezer paper and we're going to bring in all the blocks and line them up and see how well everything fits. At this point, I don't realize that there's an issue with my brown block. But at the end, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. I am loving my color choices so far. And now we're ready to go do a satin stitch. So I'll bring you along and we'll do one of these blocks together at the sewing machine. Now we are at the sewing machine. I have a piece of tearaway stabilizer underneath of my work, and I've entered all the settings for my satin stitch, and we are ready to get started. Now you'll notice if you look really close, I'm going to start my satin stitch a little bit off of the fabric into the stabilizer, and then start stitching onto my fabric. Now for this quilt, when I do my satin stitch, the needle, when it is in the furthest right position, comes in right next to the raw edge of my fabric, and when it goes over to the left position, it is going into my fabric. So that's how I've done my pieces, and so I need to keep that in mind and do all of my pieces for this quilt the exact same way, and that'll just help everything line up. You can see right here the stitches extend off of the fabric into the stabilizer. And I think doing the satin stitch is probably going to be the most time-consuming part of doing all of your puzzle pieces. But it's one of the parts that I enjoy the most. I just turn on some music and stitch away and relax, and I find it very enjoyable. I love doing this part of a quilt. So you'll go through all of your raw edges of all of your applique pieces and stitch them down. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and tear away your stabilizer and then trim off all of the satin stitches that extend off the edge of your fabric. You'll do this for each one of your pieces, and then we are ready to glue everything to our fabric base. Now I've finished stitching down all of my applique, and I have all of my pieces here, and I just want to give you a little bit of a tip. If you see that your satin stitch is starting to pull out or unravel where you've trimmed it to your fabric, you can use a little bit of fray check or just dab a little bit of glue on those stitches to help keep them from pulling out. Usually those raw edges would be in a seam allowance, but because we are doing a totally different kind of quilt this time, we don't have that seam allowance to help catch those stitches from unraveling. Now I'm going to bring in my fabric base and you'll see our last week's puzzle pieces. And we are ready to start adding this week's pieces. For this first block, I'm going to use the glue stick. I'm going to go around all of the raw edges of this square, all the way around, and I'm going to apply some glue right in the middle. Now this piece is going to line up to the bottom of A1 and to the left side of our fabric base. Make sure everything's nice and flat and straight, and I'm going to dry the glue with a good hot iron. Now I want to do a little bit of a a product review, because I tried this Easy Steam off camera, and I would love to get some pointers if you have used this product. I was not a huge fan, and so I'm not going to be using that. I'm thinking maybe the product was old, because I could not get it to work the way the instructions said on the box. But I am going to give this Heat and Bond stretch product a try during this video. I'm always up for investigating products that I haven't tried before, and I would love to get your review if you've used any of these products and what you think about them, whether you like them or you don't like them, what it is specifically that you don't like about them. Maybe it could save other crafters some money in the long run. And that's why I like trying different products on the camera or during my videos. I'm going to use this Heat and Bond stretch the same way as in last week's video with my homemade Heat and Bond light strips, except this is already sort of cut into strips for us. Just comes on a large roll, and you cut off the size piece that you want. But I've never used this specific product, and you'll see here in just a second that I must not fuse it down long enough, because most of the product stayed on the paper when I lifted it off. So I just thought I would share my trial and errors with you. You might have better success with these products than I do, but I think that if I'm going to use this method to put my blocks down, that I would probably stick with my homemade Heat and Bond light strips. See, the first piece of paper comes off pretty easily. It's the second piece, and maybe I just did not fuse it long enough to actually get the adhesive to bond with the fabric, but most of it is lifting off. So I say pooey on that and I bring back the glue stick. I'm just gonna go right over top of that Heat and Bond stretchy product with the glue stick, because at this point I'm not really confident in the fact that it will adhere my fabric block into place. And you'll see now I'm working with my troubled brown block. See how it is not lining up to position B1 and A2 very well. It's giving me a little bit of gap right at the top. I believe that this is because something went wonky when I cut this fabric piece out to the 5 inches by 5 inches. I did something that was not quite right, and now I have a little bit of gap in my flower up at the top between these two B pieces. But that's okay. I'm going to keep on keeping on. And I think in the big scheme of things, it's going to be fine. In the end, we are going to be quilting or doing a some kind of stitch to secure down all of these 5-inch pieces. And I'm thinking whatever I decide to do right in that flower section will help blend in at that little gap that I have there. But you can see my other pieces are fitting pretty well and not giving me much of an issue. Now right here, and it's probably because of the way I either traced my piece or the way I stitched my piece. It could also be the way I cut out my piece, but my satin stitch is a little bit off. To fix this, you could bring your whole fabric base in and do a satin stitch right over top of where these two pieces meet in the middle, and just join that satin stitch and blend it in. I'll dry this glue and then I'll show you how I plan on fixing it. Remember how I said art quilts, you can get away with so much more than you can with a traditional quilt. Now you could either do a satin stitch right over this area. I am going to bring in a black fabric marker and we are going to camouflage this little tiny gap in my satin stitch and straighten it right out. And when you look at the quilt, you would never know that that satin stitch did not line up. You can go through all of your seams where your satin stitch comes in and find a fabric marker that matches the color thread that you've used and fix any little areas that don't quite line up, just like this. Now, here's a thought that I had as I was stitching out these pieces this week. If you wanted to glue all of your applique into place and then glue your pieces onto your fabric base and then do a satin stitch over top all of your applique, then you probably would not run into issues where your satin stitch does not line up. However, you would be working with a larger piece of fabric in your sewing machine. And so, because I say it's your quilt, if that works easier for you, then I'm all for that. Whatever makes making this quilt simpler for you, then I say do it that way. Now we are fusing our last piece, which is F2. And you can see I've pretty much stopped experimenting with the different products and have pretty much decided to use a glue stick from here on out. See the little tiny gap in my green piece with my black satin stitch? That is probably because of the way I cut out my pieces or the way I traced them. But I'm going to come in with my trusty fabric marker and just color in those little tiny gaps. here's the fun part. If you were to never tell anybody that you did that, then I guarantee you, if you show your finished quilt to someone, they would never have guessed that you did any little touch-ups like that. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you where we are with the progress of this quilt, because this does not all fit into my screenshot here. So this is where we are with my quilt up on the wall. And I think it's really starting to come together and look like a piece of stained glass. I've had a lot of fun sewing with you today. I would love to see your pictures if you join me on Facebook. And I look forward to seeing you next week with new puzzle pieces. Bye everyone.